August 28, 1988. What was meant to be a day of celebration quickly became one of the deadliest airshow disasters in history. Thousands gathered at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Families, children, aviation fans, all looking to the sky as elite pilots prepared to perform a precision display that had been rehearsed countless times. But within seconds, something went catastrophically wrong. 3 aircraft collided mid-air. What followed wasn't just a crash, it was chaos. Fire, debris, and confusion spreading through a crowd that had no time to react. This isn't just a story about a tragic accident. It's about the chain of decisions, the overlooked risks, and the moment everything fell apart. Because sometimes, history doesn't just happen, it goes wrong.
August the 28th, 1988. It is a beautiful sunny Sunday at the United States Air Force Base at Ramstein, near Kaiserslautern, West Germany. More than 300,000 people have gathered for the Flugtag 88 airshow. Just 4 minutes into the pierced heart maneuver by the Italian Air Force display team known as the Frecce Tricolori, 3 of the 10 Aermacchi MB339 Pan jets in the demonstration collide in mid-air in front of the stunned audience. "31 spectators are killed and 36 will die later, as well as all 3 pilots who were involved in the collision. Another 346 people are injured in the explosion and fire.
Number 1 began turning towards me. I could see his bare arms as he had rolled up his sleeves and was wearing white gloves. He was wearing a white helmet. I remember thinking, if Mario ejects now, he'll hit me.
We dismounted, got outside and started to triage and treat people where they lay. So it was chaos. I mean, there's no other word for it.
To date, I have had about 20 operations, from laser treatment on the face, mouth widening, nose. In total, there were over 20 operations. In total, yes. Photographs and film that have never been seen before are finally shedding new light on the disaster, which still haunts the survivors more than 3 decades later. This is the Ramstein US Air Force Base in Germany, located near Kaiserslautern, in the Rhineland-Palatinate state of Germany. It is also the United States' largest airbase outside continental America. This is where the spectacular exhibition of the Italian Air Force aerobatic team, the Frecce Tricolori, ended in tragedy on the 28th of August 1988. Wing Commander T.E. Martin was a young medical officer and was present.
I was actually stationed at a medical aid station which was in the direct crowd central position, but somewhat further behind the crowd line. And I was there with my son, who was a first aider with St John's Cadets, the St John's Ambulance Cadets, and he was helping people out with small injuries and so on, bandaging.
This is the area where the 300,000-strong crowd watched, parents pushing their children to the front to get a better view. I myself have no memory of the day of the accident itself, but from the stories I've heard, I know that it was very hot It was August, incredibly hot. I sat in various aircraft at the exhibition, ate ice cream, and then suddenly this disaster happened. I was on the ground playing, as I wasn't so interested in the airshow itself, and was a few meters away from my mother. 2-3 meters. People flocked to what was due to be a memorable event, despite protests organized by the local evangelical church. Maurizio Guzzetti was the pilot of one of the MB339s of the Italian aerobatic team Frecce Tricolori.
Usually, the Frecce Tricolori arrive on the Friday. We have a pre-show briefing. On Saturday, we do a dry run of the show, which is a show to all effects and purposes, but with fewer spectators. And the show was on Sunday, so we arrived on the 26th.
Sibylla Jatzko is a psychiatrist and trauma counselor who lives close by Kaiserslautern and was at home on the day.
Nein, es war schon eigentlich.
It was actually a bit mystical, if you like, because the Protestant church president had warned against going to this flight day event because something could happen and that it was simply dangerous, that one shouldn't take part in an event that revolved around war and was flaunting war equipment. One shouldn't take lightly these war machines, which were, after all, for killing people.
Dass man diese Kriegsgeräte nicht so bagatellisieren soll, die Menschen töten.
Mark David Jung was just 4 years old when his mother and father took him on what was supposed to be a fun family outing.
Ramstein ist bekannt als
Ramstein is known as the event of the year, and it is like going to the fair, and therefore my father was very avid, very interested in airplanes, and so we went to the airshow as a family.
Daher haben wir die Flugschau besucht als Familie.
I was glancing up at the sky, watching and listening to the Frecce Tricolori start their aerobatic display routine as the finale for the show, when all of a sudden, very close to the start of the whole display, there was a loud bang, which sounded like a huge pyrotechnic event, and my first instinct was, well, that sounds pretty phenomenal, and then realised, of course, that the complete silence afterwards, followed by almost like a mushroom cloud of debris and flame, meant that there was something dreadful going on.
Recognizing the potential danger of hosting such a big audience, medical planners had prepared to treat up to 150 emergency patients during the annual event, mostly for heat exhaustion, cuts, sprains and other minor trauma, not unlike what might be found at a concert or other outdoor venue. It is a splendid August Sunday in Kaiserslautern, Germany, with not a cloud in the sky. The pilots of the Italian aerobatic team Frecce Tricolori of the 313th Wing Italian Air Force relax before their exhibition. At the head of the table is Lieutenant Colonel Ivo Nutarelli. The pilots are volunteers from fighter squadrons and are selected based on experience, skill and physical condition. Their aircraft is the MB339, one of the best trainers in the world.
The 339 is a vintage like me. It's a simple plane to fly, but difficult to fly a certain way. As it has a low wing loading and long wing, it is hard to get into a bank. It needs a lot of handling to get into a tonneau, unlike the Alpha jet, that has a lower performance than the 339, but is simpler to handle in certain maneuvers, such as banking maneuver. It's a great plane.
The second sequence the team performed at every airshow was the pierced heart, not the most complicated nor the most dangerous. Ivo Nutarelli, 38, was the soloist at the time of the accident. He had performed this maneuver dozens of times. Mario Naldini was the team leader. The runway was to be the public front, and the aircraft were to fly horizontally along it, except for the second spectacular stunt, the pierced heart. The group had identified the show center, the display area centered around the hot cargo pad, which was to be their reference point. The team performed a trial run, but Nutarelli pierced the heart shape 6 seconds late because low clouds had obscured his view of the rest of the team. He played it safe. The next day, there was a 10-knot wind from the south.
The formation is a 9-plane lozenge with a tail. Once vertical, the 5 planes that are central to the formation go to their right, so left of the public, the rest to the right, and the soloist separated from the formation. 2 leaves of a clover shape are formed, to use the technical term, and 2 formations cross, while the soloist theoretically should cross through after us, using the false perspective created by distance to create the illusion that he was close to the formation, while in fact he was far and well above the formation.
At 3:40 p.m., the formation appears before the crowd, climbs, and splits into 3 groups. But Ivo Nutarelli's plane is too high. At the bottom of the loop, 4 planes fly in from the right and 5 from the left.
I still get goosebumps when I talk about this, and I don't do it often. It's the first time I'm telling it in public. I was on the left edge, position 4, so the soloist came from this side. As number 4, I was watching my right, of course, throttle on the left, control column in the middle, and I was watching number 2 and number 1 so as to work on keeping the alignment. I didn't see the soloist who came in a meter ahead of me and hit the other 2. I heard a loud noise, whoosh, and I saw a flame behind me.
I turned to a colleague, an American doctor, US Air Force doctor, standing next to me, and I said, that was no airshow effect. That was real, and I don't think anyone could have survived that in the aircraft. But I wonder what's happening on the crowd line, because we couldn't actually see the crowd line from there, and we were aware of the smoke.
Ivo Nutarelli's wing sliced through the canopy of aircraft number 2 and the tail section of the team leader's plane, before crashing into the field and somersaulting into the massed spectators, taking barbed wire fencing with it.
When I saw the flame, poor Giorgio Alessio was hit in the head by the wing of aircraft number 10. So he must have died immediately. He didn't realize what was happening. I saw him disappear under me immediately. Number 1 instead was hit in the rear of the plane and in the inner left wing, so the rear and the inner left wing were missing. Number 1 began turning towards me, and I could see his bare arms because he was wearing gloves and had rolled up his sleeves. I could see the white helmet, and I remember thinking, if Mario ejects now, he'll hit me. I pulled like crazy to get out of the way.
I turned to my son, who was just standing close by, and I said, we need to go. I need you to stay here so I know where I can find you. Just stay where you are, stay put, I'll come back and collect you. And then myself, the US-American doctor that I was with at the time, and one other crew member climbed aboard a US Air Force ambulance, and we made our way to the scene.
I cringed like this, like when you drop a glass. I heard a bang, and I saw the reflection of the flames on the canopy of the plane and understood that they were both there on the ground. Neither had ejected. I was ahead of everyone, and I hadn't realized that it was number 10 that had crashed into the formation. I still thought that it was one of the other group or a small plane passing over the airport. I had no idea. I called a check, a pony check. 1 and 2 didn't reply, and I'd seen them. Number 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 didn't reply. 10, come in, 10, come in, and there was no reply. Then I understood.
Unfortunately, we couldn't take the short route because of the throngs of crowd, people running away from the scene, and other people running towards the scene because they wanted to know what was going on. So we had to go around the crowd and go to the end of the runway and drive down the runway, and couldn't believe what we saw.
Als am 28.08.1988 dieses Unglück geschah.
So on August the 28th, 1988, when the accident happened, I first heard about it on the television. I watched it on television, so of course I was incredibly shocked and terrified. I was already concerned for the demonstrators who were against this Flugtag. When I saw it on TV, when I saw this fireball on TV, I knew that there weren't 7 deaths, that there would be more, a lot more.
The closer we got, the more injuries we saw, and effectively when we saw a significant group of injured people, we told the ambulance driver to stop, and we dismounted, got outside and started to triage and treat people where they lay. So it was chaos.
I had them all come together and we went to Sembach. Of course, you can imagine what state of mind we were in, but under those circumstances you concentrate on not letting other tragedies happen. 3 and 5 who were to the right of the formation when the accident happened had damage to their planes. They had holes in their tailplanes and fuselage caused by the shrapnel of the accident. So I decided to have 3 and 5 land last, because as their planes were badly damaged, if they had crashed onto the runway, none of us would have been able to land. So we all landed, and they landed last.
We saw a lot of people that were flash burnt. In other words, they'd been burnt all over. The top layer of their clothes had been taken off, and their shoes would have been burnt off. Their skin was hanging off, black skin in shreds. Some of them were still walking around, completely dazed, I think, and unsure of what to do. They could, I know this from my study of burns injuries before this event, that people walking around with a lot of burns may not feel in pain. That's because a deep enough burn will burn through the nerve endings. But they can smell the burn, they can see the skin hanging off them.
What happened at Ramstein was the worst airshow accident ever. However, the mysteries surrounding another air crash 8 years before became woven into the narrative of what happened and why. Nutarelli and Naldini were flying close to Itavia Flight 870 shortly before it was shot down over the Mediterranean with 81 people on board. Giancarlo Nutarelli is Ivo Nutarelli's brother and believes his brother's plane was sabotaged at Ramstein to silence him.
Mio fratello la sera del 27 giugno 1980
On the evening of the 27th of June 1980, he was in flight aboard an F-104, a TF-104 of the 20th Squadron of Grosseto. Co-pilot Mario Naldini.
Pilota Mario Naldini, durante quell'ora di volo che hanno avuto.
During that hour of flight, at least that's what the radar records show, they were 2 miles away from flight IH-870, the DC-9 that unfortunately became famous as the plane that crashed into the sea near Ustica.
Famoso per la purtroppo caduta in mare vicino Ustica.
Captain Nutarelli, it would emerge, set in motion a national air defense alarm 3 times on the 27th of June 1980.
Durante questo passaggio,
during this flight, they activated or squawked code 8700 or general alarm.
Il codice 8700, che è il codice di emergenza generale, 10 minuti prima.
After which, about 10 minutes before the DC-9 disappeared from the radar screens, the 2 F-104s were ordered to return to the Grosseto Air Force Base.
Rientrare alla base di Grosseto.
It later emerged that an aerial dogfight was underway in the Italian skies at the time, which Naldini and Nutarelli may have witnessed.
Per poter avere maggiori informazioni.
To have more information, Prosecutor Bucarelli sent the Carabinieri to get the flight records from the Grosseto Air Force Base.
Mandato I carabinieri a sequestrare I registri di volo.
And these records mentioned the names of Nutarelli and Naldini.
Sono venuti fuori I nomi di Nutarelli e Naldini e quindi
So the prosecutors intended to have Nutarelli and Naldini testify soon afterwards, but this didn't happen in time.
Da parte dell'autorità giudiziaria, però purtroppo non sono arrivati in tempo.
The accident had happened. Now, the airbase commander had seconds to make a decision. The response left its mark on emergency management history. At 15:45 hours on the 28th of August 1988, 3 Italian Air Force training jets of the Frecce Tricolori aerobatic team crashed into the crowd watching one of the most important air shows in Europe, on Ramstein Air Base. The airbase commander and his staff began to respond to the emergency.
But the PA wires were cut as the aircraft that went through the crowd line took barbed wire and debris with it and sliced through. So there was really very little public information, and there was no information to us because there was nothing coming across our radio except for fire rescue chatter.
The fireball from Nutarelli's disintegrating plane set concession stands and vehicles on fire. The fuselage was stopped by the cab of an ice cream truck, saving many lives of those beyond that point. Hundreds were caught in the inferno. Dozens of helicopters flew in immediately to help.
We were congratulating ourselves because everything seems to be moving very fast and very quickly. Patients were getting off the disaster site and they were getting off to hospital. But it was that discoordinated movement of untriaged patients. They might have been triaged by me or by my colleagues, but by the time they got to the helicopter, they were not triaged any longer. And if they looked really bad, they were put on board. But sadly, those were the ones that were going to die anyway. With burns injuries, the ones that you can save are the ones that you can see are injured, but they're still walking and talking. They won't be in half an hour or an hour's time, so that's why you need to get them triaged and treated first.
Mark David Jung was taken by helicopter to a hospital, his mother to another. It would take 3 months for him and his mother to be reunited. His father perished on the site. When the accident happened, the wreckage fell directly on me and my mother hauled me out of the rubble. My mother was in Aachen. I was in Mannheim in the clinic for 2 to 3 months. It took her 2 to 3 months to find me, and it was just a different time back then. There was no civil protection like today and the like, so that the treatment options then and the care options were completely different than today, of course.
With so many children at an air show and so many children being where they would want to be, which is near the crowd line, front line, watching the airplanes, when they were injured, I have to say that I, for one, felt ill-prepared to manage trauma in very small children. In my group, I didn't have any very small children. I know that some children were injured, and I imagine that they would have been evacuated very, very quickly, because that's the way we operate. Children, let them go quickly to a hospital where there's the correct service.
The emergency call came through at 15:46. But medical personnel who had witnessed the crash were already scrambling to get into position at 4 pre-organized triage sites.
Our patients, many of them were unconscious. They were alone. Nobody was taken as a family group. They'd possibly already been separated in their family groups or in their group of friends by the time that we even saw them in the first place. They didn't carry any personal belongings with them, so we had nothing to identify them with. And so many people, even if they survived eventually, they will have been unconscious for a very long time, possibly going into intensive care and staying in intensive care for weeks, keeping tabs on who was that on their aircraft, where did they go? Well, I don't know. We had 6 people on there, not one of them had any paperwork, and when we handed them over, we didn't stop, we came back for another.
96 minutes after the collision, all the casualties had been cleared from the airfield. It was what emergency responders call the scoop and run, or Vietnam concept. but the disaster was only just beginning.
Going back into the 60s, when the term dust-off was first used for a helicopter air ambulance, the principle there was that you would fly out to your casualties and bundle them on board the helicopter, and I mean that literally, throw them on board the helicopter, do what you can in the flight, but they'd always be short flights to get the patient back to a casualty clearing station. And that was originally called the Vietnam concept and later became known as scoop and run. I was also lucky enough to work on the London air ambulance in its first year when it literally first started. And we adopted the stay and play principle, which was we were taking out the expertise from the hospital into the field.
It was very difficult for my mother to find me because there were so many hospitals, because all the relatives were distributed in different hospitals. And at that time, my mother had identified me by a cavity. She knew that this tooth of mine had cavities, then said, "This is my boy, the one who has a cavity in the third tooth." That's how I was identified in the hospital in Mannheim. Back then you did that through a phone call, but it really took almost 3 months for my mother to be able to come see me. Sibylla Jacko was called in to provide some psychological support for survivors.
No one had any idea about PTSD and the consequences for the police officers who had dropped out of their jobs. So when the medical paperwork was submitted, the response was, well, PTSD does not exist, it's made up. Yes, it's newfangled stuff. We do not have any syndrome by that name. We don't have that. There's no such thing as PTSD. It simply was not considered one of the consequences of a qualified work-related accident. Yes, what happened to them was terrible, so that was a total battle.
The day after the accident, the catastrophe, the whole assembly of doctors, nurses and paramedics that were actually part of the US Air Force 316 Division Squadron, Medical Squadron's cadre of people that were attending at the time of the incident, they were brought into the gymnasium of the base and addressed by the base commander initially, followed by a psychiatrist, who told us all a bit more about PTSD, what to expect in ourselves, how that would affect our work, our performance, our sleep, our relationships with our families. And all I can remember at the time was thinking, I've got a full clinic waiting for me, I don't need this, it doesn't affect me, I'm going to be fine. And I have to say, everything he predicted came true.
Auch wird Ramstein als auslösendes Ereignis genommen für die Forschung. Was passiert im Gehirn?
Today we have research methods to help us know what exactly happens in the brain. We have MRT or CT scans to see what's happening in the brain. And we can do that because we already know today that the brain changes and that trauma can cause permanent brain changes, that today can be classified as a disease. PTSD is now also classified as a health condition in Germany, and it's gaining more and more recognition. And so people are seen and heard, and no longer have to go through what the Ramstein bereaved had to go through. So that's a big change.
Und gehört werden und nicht mehr das durchmachen müssen, was die Ramstein-Hinterbliebenen haben durchmachen müssen. Also das ist eine große Veränderung.
I spent a week going through photographs and video and just collecting together those that would be essential for my report and for also to give a presentation on my report. And some of them were very harrowing, of course, and the one I think which gave me most impact, had most impact on me, it wasn't one picture, it was a series of 3. There's a gentleman in a red t-shirt running out of the fireball. The next picture shows him running back into the fireball, and the third picture shows him running out with a child in his arms. That man was a hero.
Wir kennen die Dia-Serie eines jungen Mannes, der hat ein
We know the series of slides of a young man. He's wearing a red t-shirt. When the fireball comes, he runs away. He stops, turns round, runs into the fire, picks up a child, turns round, runs back, stops again, turns again, runs back into the fire. And then he told us his story. The fireball came. He ran away and then thought, oh God, my child is still lying there. It suddenly occurred to him. He turns around, takes his injured and burned child out of the fire. Burned, that is, he was injured and survived. And then he later said that for a long time he couldn't cope with it at all, with the feeling of guilt. How can it be that a father runs away first and doesn't think of his child? He said the guilt was overwhelming.
Die Schuldgefühle haben ihn schier erdrückt.
Being involved in the investigation was really good for me because I could then go back and look at the records and see exactly what time things happened, who was where they were, and looked at the reports, the after-action reports from everybody concerned. But it was also the one thing that really did interest me was that I found my ability to concentrate at work suffered. So I would wander off into daydreams about what had actually happened and did I do everything I could have done and should I have done this and should I have done that. I wouldn't say they were guilt feelings, although many people do report feeling guilty, that they survived or that they shouldn't have done this or should have done something else.
Sie haben Panikattacken, sie kriegen Flashbacks. Die Flashbacks traten auf.
They have panic attacks. They get flashbacks. The flashbacks occur when they walked into a pedestrian zone and overflying planes trigger these flashbacks, or when they are close to people, or they hear a certain sound or smell something. We had police officers who could no longer go to a barbecue because the smell of burnt meat caused them to vomit immediately.
The NATO inquiry into the tragedy was completed in October of the same year, with Italian Air Force General Guido Olivero coordinating the investigation into what went wrong with the maneuver. The 154-page report is based on technical reports, witness accounts, and photos and videos. However, 40 years later, it seems that some important information is missing, and the Olivero report incomplete. Maurizio Guzzetti has studied the videos.
In the videos, we see that number 10, while the formation was opening, instead of turning to the south, due also to the wind that kept him closer to the runway, closer to the spectators, went higher and more vertical than normal, and found himself above the crossing point instead of further south than the crossing point. So instead of doing a normal loop, as he would have done in a normal situation, tried to correct it. So instead of making a circular loop, he squared it off a bit, trying to take his plane further south, pulling more than usual at the lowest point in the loop.
The error begins as aircraft number 10, piloted by Ivo Nutarelli, flies 500 feet higher than the rest of the group. As the two sides of the heart begin to form, we see that Nutarelli is late. He is told he is late by ground control, and he suddenly dives to recover time lost. But then he is in advance.
From the film and photos, we see that he has the air brakes out, so he realized he was in advance. And since he had the air brakes out, he surely had the engine in idle, because you'd never have the air brakes out. It would be like driving a car with the brakes on and accelerating. So he had the air brakes out and the engine in idle, which shows he realized he was too early.
Nutarelli is by now just 33 meters from the ground and over the hot cargo pad, his point of reference to begin his maneuver. However, the report identifies tall trees and lampposts as possible distractions for the pilot, who may not have seen how low he was. At the last minute, he realized that a collision was imminent and tried to change course. It was too late.
Once he had reached the lowest point, he closed the loop. And if he'd continued pulling up as he was, around 6G I think, he would have passed above us by a lot. And I can't explain why. Maybe a bird hitting the canopy, or a momentary blackout. There are 10,000 possible reasons, but I'll never know which is right. Instead of continuing to pull up, he stopped for a second and a half. And you can see that he realized that he was headed towards the formation. He pulled up hard, but with the low energy he had, the engine in idle, and the air brakes out, he changed the angle of the aircraft, but didn't change the trajectory.
All the investigations, Italian, German, American, came to the same conclusion. There was one simple reason: pilot error. The aircraft was simply too low and too fast. Captain Ivo Nutarelli would be blamed for the 1988 Ramstein airshow crash, though his family have long argued there is more to the story than meets the eye.
My brother's name came out on the 12th of August 1988, 16 days before the Ramstein accident. And above all, why Ramstein? Because Ramstein is a US Air Force base, so it's on American soil, a territory where the Italian prosecutors and judicial system have no jurisdiction.
By a quirk of fate, the Aviation Museum of Rimini, close to where Giancarlo Nutarelli lives, was able to buy what was left of the 3 damaged aircraft, including Nutarelli's Pony 10, with the tail section. The survivors and families of Ramstein victims came to view the wreckage and meet Giancarlo many years later.
Dann haben wir gemerkt, dass wir in Rimini von diesem Fernsehteam sehr geschützt werden mussten, weil wir ständig irgendwelche Begleiter.
We noticed that we needed the protection of this camera team in Rimini, because we were constantly accompanied by people looking after us. And then we met Giancarlo Nutarelli, and it was very important to him to get to know us. So we noticed that this poor man was under so much pressure, and he also said that he was threatened. But why is he being threatened? What is the reason for this? Something was not right. When the gates and doors are open to the imagination, when something is not quite right, people will claim that there is something wrong. There was this connection between the 2 events, and then fantasies emerged. But there was no evidence. We wanted to clear up this fantasy.
When I hear talk about the ties between the Ustica incident and the fact that Nutarelli and Naldini were in flight on the evening of the Ustica accident, and that they were killed for this reason, that their planes were sabotaged, that the altimeter was sabotaged even, this is ridiculous. But it makes me angry that information is manipulated like this. I repeat, the altimeter could not have had any part to play in this tragedy.
Io voglio che mio fratello venga riabilitato, voglio che venga detto chiaramente che
I want my brother's name to be restored. I want it to be made clear that my brother was not the cause of the Ramstein massacre, as I call it, but a victim, a man who lost his life for his country, because someone didn't know how to manage the Ustica case, so created the Ramstein
e di
case.
conseguenza ha creato il caso Ramstein.
1 year later, the total number who had died at Ramstein was established at 70, 31 of whom died at the scene. In addition to the 3 Italian pilots, 63 of the dead were German, 4 were American, 1 was French, 1 was Dutch, and 1 was British, according to the official reports.
It's still hard for me to talk about it, but the worst moment was returning to the base that evening and seeing a truck with a tarpaulin over it and the head of a child protruding out of the sheet. I still can't come to terms with it. The next day we left to return to Italy, and going by the car park, it was terrible to see this enormous car park with cars still parked randomly, cars owned by people who would not be going home.
Building a monument to the 70 victims was a first step in healing the wounds, but it was not easy. The US Air Force would not have a monument on base, and only by chance did a piece of land come up for sale just outside the base perimeter. Just off a parking lot before the base entrance, the monument stands hidden in the woodland and ferns on land the Victims Association bought privately. It is modest and hard to find, but represented the first step in the healing process for the survivors and victims' family members. They come here to sit and reflect at the edge of the airfield where they lost their loved ones.
Eine ältere Dame, eine Mutter eines bei diesem Unglück.
An elderly lady called us. She was the mother of a person who was seriously injured in the disaster, and she said, "Now 10 years have passed and I would really like my son to come into the group for the 10th anniversary now." What happened? This young man was seriously injured. He was with his girlfriend at the time. They wanted to marry 14 days after Ramstein. Well, he lost her and also their 8-month-old baby. He'd seen it all and then survived with severe injuries. And he'd actually just sat at home and watched TV for 10 years.
Und hatte tatsächlich 10 Jahre lang nur zu Hause gesessen und Fernsehen geguckt.
I think that the reports are all very incomplete. I think that with such great tragedies, there should be more transparency and more openness, and not to keep the files secret. It is very important for relatives and also for the government to gain credibility, because that is what our government is there for, to represent us, to protect us, that there is accountability and questions are answered. Psychologists came to realize that one thing that helped survivors heal was to visit the scene of the disaster to replace the trauma with new memories of the place.
Die Überlebenden sind dorthin gekommen, sich, wenn man so
The survivors came there too, if you will, to be able to internally integrate a different image of this point of impact. That is, they have the horrific image of this disaster, and then something starts. They begin to reconcile it with the fact that, yes, now there is peace in this place. And that is the beginning of a reconciliation, of an acceptance, the beginning of a change. And it's only possible with the post-traumatic stress disorder through images, because the images of the catastrophe are engraved in their
weil
minds.
sie die Bilder mit der Katastrophe ja total abgespeichert haben.
Looking back, there were lessons learned from the emergency response to the Ramstein airshow disaster. The importance of a clear leader. The unexpected problem of access roads being blocked by fleeing spectators. The language barriers of first responders. And the need to try to do more to identify patients and casualties faster.
Lessons there are: make sure you control evacuation and let the patients go in packets. Find out what patients the hospital wants to take first. Don't just flood everybody then. Hold the ones that don't need emergency treatment straight away. Now this is two groups. It could be the very minor injuries. It could also be the ones that are not expected to live. If you can just keep those behind and give them good pain relief, tender loving care, make them comfortable, and if they survive until all the other ones which have to go, then they can be moved.
Maurizio Guzzetti became the Frecce Tricolori soloist and pulled the team out of the dark cloud it had come home to after the disaster.
I was asked to become the soloist, but the problem was there was no one to train me. I had to invent it. Yes, I watched all the film, but all the maneuvers, the tricks, everything, I knew nothing. I had to invent the job of soloist from scratch. Terrified, justifiably terrified, that if something happened, the Frecce Tricolori were finished.
Legal battles dragged on for months for those mutilated by debris or shrapnel, or those disfigured by burns in the firestorm. Some would receive compensation, but not nearly enough for what they endured. According to NATO rules, the Italian authorities were held responsible for the disaster. This made legal rectification very difficult for the victims. The compensation payments were straightforward, but they in no way compensate for what happened. In addition, the damages were paid by the German government, not the American or the Italian government. I think that if all three are responsible, everyone should participate, take part, and be open to questions and answers, which, unfortunately, has not happened so far. What happened to Ivo Nutarelli and his plane in the decisive moments before the crash will continue to be the subject of speculation. An inexplicable error, an immense tragedy, and decades of fruitless suspicion still haunt the crash. Though the Frecce Tricolori have regained admiration in Italy and abroad, a painful chapter in the team's past remains obscure behind a veil of institutional silence.
And while Ramstein forced change in the skies, danger was still building elsewhere. Far from the spotlight, on the ground, another chain of failures was already in motion. Not all disasters unfold in the sky. Some happen in the middle of the night, when no one is watching. June 29, 2009, Viareggio, Italy. A quiet coastal town where families slept just meters from the railway line that cut through the heart of the community. Just before midnight, a freight train carrying liquefied gas derailed. At first, it looked like a routine accident, but within moments, the air itself turned deadly. A massive explosion tore through the streets, engulfing homes in fire. Entire families were caught in their sleep, with no warning and nowhere to run. This wasn't just a derailment, it was a chain reaction of failures, mechanical, structural, and human, that turned a single fault into a catastrophe. Because sometimes, what goes wrong isn't immediate, it builds, silently, until it's too late.
June the 29th, 2009. It is a quiet, warm day in Tuscany. The residents of the small coastal town of Viareggio are relaxing in their homes on a typical summer evening like any other. A freight train of 14 tanker cars full of liquefied petroleum gas is passing through the station. Travelling through Viareggio at just under 100 kilometers per hour, the front axle of the first tanker breaks. The train comes off the rails. The tank car is ripped open, releasing a cloud of petroleum vapor into the neighborhood. Within minutes, the cloud ignites. The entire area erupts into an inferno, fire racing through the streets. Vehicles explode one after another. Viareggio looks like a war zone.
That night, I heard a sound I could tell wasn't normal right away. The sound of steel breaking and the rails screeching. Right after that, I could smell gas.
The sky all of a sudden became red from the sea to the mountains. It was like a sunset happening at the wrong time, because it was just before midnight. We all asked ourselves what was going on.
There is Viareggio before June 29 and Viareggio after June 29. And I, being a Viareggio local to the end, feel this very deeply.
From the Italian point of view, it's the first and the worst rail accident that has ever happened since World War II.
32 men, women and children die in Italy's worst train disaster. One of the worst in all of Europe. 14 people die instantly, burned to death or crushed as they sleep in their homes. 18 die later of severe burn injuries in the days and weeks after the accident. More than a decade after the tragedy, a deep sense of injustice still runs through this Tuscan community as the families continue to fight for truth and change. San Martino di Trecate, Piedmont. Every day, dozens of trains leave the rusty tracks from this 2-kilometer-long labyrinth of high, belching smokestacks of the Sarpom ExxonMobil oil refinery in the Po Valley Plain near Milan. Freight train 50325 leaves Trecate oil refinery on June the 29th, 2009 at 3:35 in the afternoon. The locomotive is pulling 14 tanker cars, each carrying 45 metric tons of LPG, a total of 630 tons. They are bound for Aversana Petroli, a gas company in southern Italy. The convoy stops at Trecate station for a safety and logistics check by Trenitalia, Italy's railway company. It is given the green light, and it rumbles on toward the sea, passing Genoa and changing drivers at La Spezia. It is a warm summer evening, shortly before midnight, and people are still strolling about the Tuscan city of Viareggio as the train approaches. Marco Piagentini and his wife, Stefania, are settling in for bed in Via Ponchielli, having already put to sleep their 3 sons, Leonardo, 8, Luca, 4, and Lorenzo, 2.
I was down on the couch watching television. The kids were sleeping, so there was that moment of freedom when you can actually relax a bit. Then I heard this strange noise. It was abnormal, because trains, of course, make noise normally when they go by.
Freight train 50325 passes through the station at 90 kilometers per hour, just under the 100 kilometer per hour speed limit. Then, 400 meters past the main station, it screeches off the rails and begins flipping onto its side. The axle of the first wagon has broken in half, and the wagons begin to veer off the track. The first tank wagon falls onto its side and rolls over a railroad spike, ripping a large hole along its side until it comes tumbling to a halt to the left. The next 4 wagons also overturn, and the 2 following come off the rails but remain upright. Emanuela Menichetti, 21, has just returned from a vacation with her friend Sara.
That night, Emanuela was sleeping at her friend Sara's house, and they were playing cards on the bed. That's what her father told me, because that night 3 people died. Sara, her mother, and Emanuela. He was the only survivor. They ran out to see what was happening, and in that house there were 4 people. 3 died, and he was the one who survived.
Disaster is about to strike. What they cannot know is that a silent but deadly killer is on the loose. A blue cloud of liquefied petroleum gas is spreading into the streets and seeping into homes and cars. Just seconds before the tragedy, Marco Piagentini steps outside and smells the gas.
I went in the house, got my wife and kids. I got the middle one, and Stefania got the little one. And we went outside. I got onto the pavement on the other side of the road and realized that Leonardo was missing. I leave Stefania and Lorenzo on the pavement. I put Luca in the car that was parked next to my wife, and I start going back in. I reach the front door, and I hear an explosion. I look up, and I see a wall of fire that's higher than my house.
The gas spreads for just over 2 minutes, and then, at 11:51, ignites. The explosion is massive, heard all across the city as a flash of white, and then a series of fireballs. Donatella Francesconi was the local newspaper reporter on duty that night for Il Tirreno.
c'era la preoccupazione che potesse essere inalato da parte della popolazione.
There was the worry that there could be something toxic that could be inhaled by the residents. The first anxiety on the station side of town was getting thousands of people who had come out onto the street away from the area, because the whole town had heard the explosions, seen the flames and the red sky.
Il cielo rosso si erano visti da tutte le parti della città.
As fire begins racing through the city, one of the train drivers, Andrea D'Alessandro, calls the station manager as he flees.
Pronto! Sono il macchinista del treno a Viareggio. Abbiamo deragliato, noi siamo scappati, ma è scoppiato tutto. Portavamo gas liquefatto infiammabile. Blocca i treni più lontano che poi da Viareggio. È scoppiato tutto qua. È scoppiato. C'è la stazione in fiamme.
It is the beginning of a decade-long nightmare. The initial explosion brought down 3 residential buildings near the station. Vehicles exploded like napalm bombs as the fire followed the gas. Marco's house collapsed onto him in a pile of burning rubble. He was unable to reach Leonardo.
I thought I had completely melted because I could not even move a finger on my hand. Then I started yelling help, even though I could not breathe. I could hear explosions because there were cars and motorcycles exploding continuously. The heat was excruciating. I could feel everything burning, my feet burning, and I couldn't do anything. I was conscious. It was like in an oven.
Le bimbe uscirono.
The girls went out and ran towards the state route, Aurelia. Emanuela fell and Sara managed to pick her up. Then they laid down on the pavement, down there on the Via Aurelia. There is a photo, coincidentally, and it's of Sara and my daughter lying on the ground, totally naked, eaten up by fire, with a volunteer worker who was picking them up.
Dal fuoco con un volontario che le stava prendendo.
Across the city, residents were fleeing for their lives. Firefighters at the scene knew that they had to get closer to fight the flames engulfing Viareggio after a train derailed. What had exploded? One firefighter climbed up to a pedestrian walkway over the railway and saw the gas sign on one of the 14 tanks. LPG. Immediately, the firefighters began trying to cool the other 13 time bombs that could explode at any minute.
One of the
experts in the civil parties told us it would have taken just one more tank to blow up to raise Viareggio to the ground all the way to the sea.
Daniela Rombi got a call from her daughter, Emanuela Menichetti, just 21, who said she was in the emergency room of the hospital in Versilia.
Mi squilla il telefono e mi dicono.
My phone rang and they said, "This is the hospital, Versilia, and Emanuela wants to talk to you." And I said, "Emanuela, weren't you supposed to stay at home?" You know, even a little angrily. And she said, "No, Mummy, there was an accident, there was a fire." I said, what do you mean by a fire? What fire? And she said, "Don't worry, Mum, nothing happened to me." So I got to the hospital at Cesanello, and there was another guy running through the corridor like we were. And I said, "Are you from Viareggio? What happened?" And he said, "A train exploded." I couldn't get my head around it, because in my mind, at most, a train would have just derailed.
No, continuavo a non capire, perché per me I treni al massimo deragliavano.
When firefighters finally reached Marco Piagentini, he was alive but had suffered third-degree burns across all of his body.
I heard a voice saying, "Is there anybody here? Is there anybody here?" And I yelled, and they heard me, and they said, "Don't worry, we will come back and pull you out." And I said, "Hurry up, because I can't stay alive much longer." Life was draining out of me. Then When they extracted me from the rubble, I fainted.
His wife died after 3 days of agony. His youngest son after 2. The 5-year-old had been burned alive. Marco woke up from a coma in the Padua burn ward a month later. Amazingly, they found Leonardo, saved from the crumbling house by a mattress that protected him. A moment of hope in a night filled with terror and death. The morning after, pictures and video of the fire had circulated around the world. The station smouldered. The scorched earth spread for kilometers from the sea to the station to the Croce Verde headquarters to Via Ponchielli.
It was the beginning of summer because it was the 29th of June. There were people in the streets, they were carefree, they were tourists, but instead there was silence. Flags were at half-mast in the beach bars, there was no music, they were days of silence.
The news started to come out of the deceased. Viareggio has 66,000 residents. It is not a big city. We all know each other. So this constant bulletin announcing the dead was excruciating. Incredibly, some of the victims were the very residents who had 8 years earlier formally requested a barrier between the track and the street. A request never acted on by Ferrovie dello Stato.
The gas found a way to get here, because on this side there was no wall, there was an open fence, while on the other side there was a wall. So the wall would have been a mitigating factor in the disaster. The request for that wall was signed by people who died that very night. There are the signatures of people who are no longer here today.
Daniela Rombi had spoken to her daughter immediately after the explosion, so was taken aback by the news she received the following day at the hospital.
Verso le 7:30 arriva il professore, il primario, con
Around 7:30, the professor arrived, the lead surgeon with another doctor who was crying. He said she was severely burned. We've treated her, and they just kept talking and talking. And at the end I said, but wait, she's not going to die because I spoke to her. She'll be okay, won't she? And he looked at me and he said, Mum, perhaps you don't understand. She could pass away from one minute to the next.
The city was still smoking the next day, June the 30th, when railway officials addressed the press and public gathered at City Hall.
Nella sala di rappresentanza del municipio di Viareggio, gremita.
In the City Hall, packed full with citizens and journalists, railway CEO Mauro Moretti arrived and in a very few words said 2 things. There was no responsibility of the Ferrovie dello Stato and that they would not pay a single euro for what had happened.
In the beginning, he became a symbol because of his arrogant behavior. The ex-CEO, Mauro Moretti, never said sorry. Even, allow me to use the expression politically, never gave a justification for what happened. He just put himself out of the context.
More than 30,000 people attended the state funeral on July the 7th for 15 of the victims. Another 7 were buried with Islamic rites in Morocco. Other victims, like Emanuela and Sara, were fighting for their lives in burn wards, with their families at their side.
After 15 or 20 days, they asked me if I wanted to go in and see her. And I was afraid and said, no, I don't want to go in. And this nurse, an amazing male nurse, said, why don't you want to go in? And I said, if I go in and touch her and then she dies, what will I do? And he said, but if you don't go in, you don't touch her and she still dies, what will you do?
It was the last time Daniela saw her daughter alive.
E quindi entrai. Nel viso lei non era.
And so I went in. Her face had not been that disfigured. She was beautiful. She was sleeping. But this young man told me, don't lift up the sheets. And I don't know why, but I didn't lift them up.
E io non so perché non le alzai.
Emanuela died 42 agonizing days later. In the days after the deadly Viareggio train derailment and explosion, prosecutors launched an investigation, and experts descended onto the scene to measure the destruction. The first 5 tanks overturned 370 meters from the point of derailment. The broken axle was hurled 30 meters. Even without microscopic examination, several layers of paint applied to cover the decades of corrosion and rust were visible to the eye. For prosecutors, it was immediately clear they needed to know everything about freight train 50325 and the broken, decrepit axle 98331, owned by the European subsidiaries of GATX, an American multinational rail wagon leasing company. Engineer Fabrizio Derrico was one of the technical experts called in to testify for civil parties.
L'assile di fatto è un vecchio prodotto.
The axle is an old product from 1974. But we only have documentation on this axle since the early 2000s. The chronology from 1974 to the early 2000s was not supplied.
La fabbricazione al 2002 non è nota, non è stata fornita.
Axle 98331, according to records provided by GATX, had actually been built in 1974 at the LKW Karl Marx Lokomotivbau in Babelsberg, near Berlin, when East Germany was still behind the Iron Curtain. An axle that travels in snow goes under stresses that are different from one in warm weather. Knowing where it travels would have been important, even how many kilometers it traveled. No one knew. It was used in Eastern Europe for 2 decades, before arriving at ZOS Trnava workshop in Slovakia in 2002 for a reprofiling and inspection, which it passed, so it could be resold and reused yet again. It would take 4 years to complete a proper inquiry, exposing how the deadly train came together in a web of questionable deals that put profit before safety.
Le società del gruppo Ferrovie dello Stato,
the Ferrovie dello Stato and its subsidiaries did not know what kind of maintenance the tanker cars that were rolling on their rails had undergone, nor the instrumentation they were equipped with.
sulla propria rete ferroviaria.
Aversana Petroli, a company belonging to the Cosentino family, repeatedly investigated for its alleged organized crime ties, needed to move LPG cheaply from the Exxon refinery to southern Italy. The Italian State Railways is a holding company that used a number of its smaller private subsidiaries to make the train happen. FS Logistica rented tank wagons for just 22 to 28 euros a day from GATX Europe, an Austria-based subsidiary of the American multinational. Then, FS Logistica did a deal with Rete Ferroviaria Italiana, which operated the train tracks, as well as with Trenitalia, which had the locomotive and the drivers. The deal with Aversana Petroli would bring a loss of 12,000 euros a year for Italian railways.
un elemento determinante in ogni indagine, cioè cercare I rapporti economici.
One of the determining elements in all investigations was to look at the nature of the economic deals being made and expose them. It emerged that FS Logistica paid €22 a day to transport a train from northern Italy all the way to Campania. Renting a car or a bicycle in vacation costs more than that. So this was an alarm bell because the chain of relationships eventually do concretely become an actual train that crosses Italy.
E diventa un treno che attraversa tutta l'Italia.
After passing inspection, the wheel set was mounted onto wagon number 3381 in Poland. GATX leased the wagon to Cargo Chemical SRL in Italy, which later became FS Logistica SPA. It arrived in Italy in January of 2005 for private use for the Trecate-Gricignano line, subleased from Rete Ferroviaria Italiana. In June 2006, the tanker car and its axle and wheel sets passed an inspection in Slovakia, despite a crack which experts said had likely started to form. Cargo Chemical paid a measly €4 for the inspection. By September 2006, it was rolling again. Since the wagon was bound for private freight use, no paperwork was exchanged about the history of the wagon or its parts.
On the 30th of June, FS Logistica writes a fiery email to GATX. It's part of the trial documents and were central to the case and the effort to try to identify who was responsible. And they wrote, "What did you send us? Tell us what you sent us."
Cargo Chemical had rented a wagon with axle 98331 from GATX and then subleased it to Trenitalia that actually handled the train. But the wheel set and axle were flagged as having a worn area by Deutsche Bahn inspectors in Ingolstadt, and it was sent by GATX to Jungenthal workshop in Hanover for inspection, a company under GATX's control.
L'eliminazione dal carrello, quindi la separazione dal carrello sotto cui erano montate.
The separation from wagon and the parts mounted on it happens in 2008. And this happens because wheels were flagged as having been worn from excessive braking. So they were sent to the Jugendtal workshop in Hanover, and that workshop was under the oversight of GATX.
Per essere manutenute.
They were completely overhauled.
Essere completamente revisionate.
Again, the crack went undetected, although Jugendtal claims they ran ultrasound tests and magnetic particle tests. 3 layers of old paint suggested the axle had not been sanded in order to perform these tests.
Durante la revisione che avviene all'interno
During maintenance at Jugendtal, they did a complete overhaul of the axle. But our tests took us to the absolute certain conclusion that no magnetoscopic or ultrasound tests had been completed.
E nulla di controllo ultrasonoro è stato eseguito su quella sile.
GATX Rail Austria ordered the axle to be transferred from Jugendtal to Cima Riparazione mechanic shop in Mantua to be mounted on the wagon. And still, no one saw or flagged the crack during what was supposed to be a thorough inspection.
Viene scartato il pacco che viene inviato con la certificazione.
They opened the package. The 2 axles were taken out and they were mounted on the wagon and then put back into circulation. And they made a series of trips before arriving at the end of their voyage at Viareggio.
Farà una serie di viaggi per poi terminare la sua corsa a Viareggio.
Nell'aula si dice: ma in cosa consiste il controllo visivo che voi dovevate fare sempre per il manuale VP di questa assile?
When in court they asked what it meant to do a visual inspection. The mechanics responded that it meant looking in the track to see if the package was okay. The fact that they all had a rule book that was standardised for everyone led them to go a bit on autopilot, so reducing times and costs, this is the main point, and then on to the next axle. It was a bit of a factory. Go, 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 push them out, produce, on to the next one, and, cross your fingers.
Sfornare, andare avanti e sperare.
Laboratory analysis would estimate the crack went back at least 10 to 20 years, during which the axle had travelled somewhere between 500,000 and 1.2 million kilometres before the fatal derailment in Viareggio. So who owned the killer train, and who was in charge of maintenance? What emerged over 8 years and 2 trials about Freight Train 50325 and the infamous Axle 98331 is a cautionary tale of a capitalist shell game that saw old parts from the former Soviet bloc sold or leased onto Western Europe's railroads at rock-bottom prices through Central European middlemen.
FS Logistica fa un contratto con Trenitalia.
FS Logistica does a contract with Trenitalia, which owns the locomotive. Trenitalia doesn't have tank cars, so it rents them from GATX. Then Trenitalia makes a whole train that was pulled by Trenitalia with tanks by GATX that runs on the RFI, Rete Ferroviaria Italiana.
Viaggia sulla rete di RFI, Rete Ferroviaria Italiana. Per Ferrovie dello Stato sarebbe stato importantissimo sapere.
For Italian railways, it would have been important to have traceability. But it is evident if Italian railways had a system of traceability of the axles, wheels, brakes and other parts, it could have better managed this situation and enacted mitigating factors.
E quindi porre in essere delle misure mitigative, si dicono.
And even though the axle broke, the fire would not have happened if the tank had not been ripped open during the derailment. What caused it to rupture? Prosecutors maintained it was a railroad stake, specifically stake number 24, that had been left in the curve of the railway despite regulations requiring stakes to be removed. Fabrizio De Rico and his team created a 3D video that treated the derailment like a crime scene.
Dobbiamo ricostruire la scena del delitto.
We reconstructed the scene of the crime, using photographs and looking at all the points of evidence left by the wagon as it transited through the station. In other words, the footprints of the assassin.
Ovvero le orme dell'assassino.
Il quadro accusatorio secondo noi è stato immediatamente chiaro.
The accusatory framework for us was immediately clear. The first axle was not properly maintained, it broke, and that started the whole dynamic. And the rupture of the tank by the stake which ripped it open. This was also a theme during the trial.
Anche questo è stato un tema del processo, ha squarciato la cisterna.
No matter what did or did not cause the rupture, the accident would never have happened had the axle not broken in the first place.
Da tecnico.
From a technical point of view, we shouldn't even be here talking about the stake because the axle should not have broken in the first place. Because quite simply, the maintenance that should have been done, they decided not to do. Full stop. As far as the rupture of the tank is concerned, we know for certain that it was the stake, from all the accurate reconstructions that we made because that was our duty towards those who asked us what was the cause.
Why wasn't the Italian railway inspecting and certifying the public and private rolling stock transporting people and freight along its lines? Why hadn't the spikes been removed? Independent forensic experts performed stress tests on a model of the axle, carrying out metallurgy tests, ultrasound and magnetoscopic testing in 2011. The crack may have formed 10 or even 20 years ago, but by the time the axle broke, it was probably 10 to 13 centimeters long, with a slant. The crack should have been easy to spot in a visual check, had one actually been carried out.
Vi è il cedimento dell'assile ferroviario, che non doveva mai avvenire.
Here we have the breakage of the railway axle that should never have happened. Did we have the condition to avoid the axle from breaking? Certainly yes. Was it unpredictable? No, on the contrary, it's easy to predict breakages, especially on axles that have this very visible damage.
I controlli se non vengono fatti,
If the checks are done only partially or are just on paper, whereby what's important is the paperwork, this is a whole world that needs to be corrected. Till today, we still don't have information. Despite all the requests, we still don't know what has been done to improve safety. Between June 2009 in Viareggio and today, we still don't know.
Se è stata aumentata, noi non lo sappiamo.
Il sistema ferroviario è un sistema che da sempre si dà le proprie regole.
The Italian railway system always regulates itself, just until a few years before the accident in Viareggio. So up to 2008, there was no national body overseeing railway safety. The entity that oversaw the railways was the railways itself. The inspected was also the inspector.
Era controllore e controllato.
During the course of the trial, a number of scandalous failings in railway safety emerged, and one man was deemed responsible above all others. The courts discovered that most of the decisions leading up to the Viareggio train disaster fell under the oversight of a number of European rail company bosses and those reporting directly to them. Most notably, Italian Railways CEO Mauro Moretti, who, before a Senate inquiry, stated that the state-owned train company, Ferrovie dello Stato, had an excellent record, aside from Viareggio, which he described as an unfortunate episode. To speak about an unfortunate episode when 32 people died was out of place. That term came out many times, and especially stuck with the families of the victims, because they considered it injury upon injury. It would have just taken a bit more solidarity instead of discussing an unfortunate episode. Also because we know from what came out in the trial that this disaster was anything but an unfortunate episode.
When Moretti said in the Senate hearing that, aside from the unfortunate episode of Viareggio, they have got better in terms of safety, then he later said, every time there is a train accident, it is as if the world is collapsing. Well, for us, the world did collapse.
Every wagon that derailed at Viareggio had been subleased from abroad at rock-bottom prices and inspected in Slovakia in 2002 and 2006 for a cost of just over €4 per check. Things were being done on the cheap, and safety warnings were ignored. Jugenthal mechanics testified they never found cracks in axles, only in wheel rims. German reports showed there had been 7 accidents between 2000 and 2006 in which axles broke. Yet GATX openly blocked an effort by Germany to freeze use of its old axles.
La circolare che l'agenzia tedesca per la sicurezza ferroviaria EVA aveva emesso nel...
The report that the German transport agency EVA had circulated in July of 2007 said that there had been repeated important railway accidents throughout Europe, fortunately without any victims, in which axles built in Germany had broken, and they said to stop them. GATX, which is the company that was owner of the tank cars that derailed in Viareggio 2 years later, injuncted against the report, which was frozen and not acted upon.
The wheels of Italian justice grind slowly, but the trains continued to derail at full speed in the following years. In 2012, regional train 2855 from Voghera to Rimini derailed, injuring 30 of the 250 passengers on board. In 2016, 2 regional passenger trains on a single-track section of the Bari-Barletta railway collided head-on, killing 23 and injuring 54. In 2018, a train derailed near Pioltello, killing 3 and injuring 46.
In un altro caso di trasporto merci non pericolose di un treno
In
deragliato.
another case, there was a train transporting non-dangerous freight that derailed in the station of Bressanone. A few years later, it emerged that the workshop had not followed the correct assembly of the axles and the wheel sets. We are talking yet again about a derailment post-Viareggio, and just coincidentally, once again, we are talking about the same workshop.
Casualmente della stessa officina.
Little has changed since the Viareggio disaster. Freight trains can still roll through towns at 100 kilometers per hour, and there is no requirement to tell local authorities what they are hauling. Viareggio even saw its station master removed in a recent round of cuts. The presence of the station master prevented more victims. That night, the station master stopped an intercity train at Torre del Lago. He stopped it 2 kilometers from Viareggio, so it did not find itself in the middle of the explosion. The lack of accountability of Italian railways and the arrogance of its managers only further enraged families of the victims, who began seeking out solidarity from associations of victims of other tragedies where the state was negligent. They called themselves My Ideal World, in Italian, Il Mondo che Vorrei.
We started meeting with other associations. We met with those from the Moby Prince in Livorno, and we went there. And there it was born, this idea to create a network.
We went to Turin to meet with the mothers of the Thyssen victims 3 times. We went to San Giuliano di Puglia, to Vajont.
There was Casalecchio di Reno, the asbestos problem of Casale Monferrato. There were many associations, and Viareggio was, unfortunately, just one of the many. Disasters in the country where no one was taking forward the memory of the case, except the families of the victims.
After the immediate media coverage of each disaster, a disturbing underlying trend remains.
Profit was put ahead of human life. This was the common thread. This allowed us to find ourselves in a difficult moment, in life-changing circumstances, when we had lost our loved ones, to find the courage to say, we must do something.
Veramente dobbiamo cambiare qualcosa.
4 years after one of Italy's most fatal train derailments and explosions, the trial of those accused began in November 2013 and unfolded across 140 hearings over nearly 3 years. 7.5 years after the tragedy, judges issued the first round of convictions, a total of 250 years in prison for 33 different people on trial. GATX Rail Germany and its subsidiary GATX Rail Austria were found responsible for the rolling stock, and top administrators at both companies convicted. Mechanics at Jungenthal and Cima machine shops were also convicted for not following standard inspection procedures. Former Leonardo CEO Mauro Moretti was sentenced for his role as CEO of Rete Ferroviaria Italiana from 2001 to 2006, but acquitted for his role as CEO of Ferrovie dello Stato from 2006 to 2014, while former RFI CEO Michele Mario Elia was also initially convicted.
La maggior parte delle condanne sono state confermate.
The majority of the convictions were confirmed, including those of Italian Railways and GATX and Jungenthal, the 2 major companies involved. But some sentences were reduced on appeal because of the time that had passed, because some of the crimes were beyond the statute of limitations.
Fra il primo grado e l'appello alcuni reati si sono prescritti.
2 reati sono già andati in
2 crimes were beyond the statute of limitations: the bodily harm and the manslaughter by fire. Our lawyers tell us, with all the years that have gone by, causing manslaughter by fire added up to perhaps 3 or 4 months less of prison. Aside from the fact that I want them to do those 3 or 4 months, that's just my opinion. But it isn't a question of 3 or 4 months, it's the principle. If there's no longer the crime of homicide by fire, then what did these people die of? What did my daughter die of? She didn't have a tumour, she wasn't a drug addict, she wasn't going at 150 kilometres per hour in a car. She was at home. They were all at home. What did they die of?
Era a casa. Tutti erano a casa. Ma di che cosa sono morti?
Ci sono magistrati, ci sono...
There are magistrates, judges, courts, the accused, but there are also the users of justice, us, who unfortunately find themselves facing a deficient justice system. We just want to let people know and ask those who are qualified to make justice just. Let the truth come out. There is just one truth, not 2 truths like they say. A truth from the trial and the real truth. No, it can't be broken down into parts. You can't have a trial for the deaths of 32 people and then not give those 32 people justice, because that's where it all begins.
Perché tutto nasce da lì.
The Viareggio families were among those who lobbied for an important victory: passing of the law prohibiting a statute of limitations in certain cases.
E la paura è tanta, perché comunque il tempo passa, comunque loro sono...
We are afraid because time passes, because they are powerful and we're nobodies, and because they go around and always remix themselves into key positions. But we're watching, with our heads high, because we did not take any money. They did not buy the deaths of our children. We are holding our heads high. Watch out, watch out.
Guai a loro, guai a loro.
Of the 339 million trains that rolled along Italy's tracks the year before the Viareggio accident, only 18% were freight trains. Yet it took just one to change the face of this Tuscan town forever.
This silence, this stopping of everything, this silence and this dramatic magic moment repeats itself every 29th of June.
Rosario Campo, 42 anni.
That night, we lost our loved ones. But what happened here in Viareggio touched the whole community. We found ourselves in a situation like when you are little and you discover that Santa Claus does not exist. Here in Viareggio, we found ourselves realizing that Santa Claus no longer exists.
Babbo Natale non esisteva più.
Ma te guarda come siamo fortunati, diceva mio marito. Lavoriamo mezza giornata al giorno perché lui...
Look at how fortunate we are, we would say, because he worked at the post office and I worked in the city hall. We worked part-time and then had the rest of the day to enjoy life. The girls were fine. We laughed and joked about it as we were a normal family. What do we have to lose? Well, we lost it all. They killed us, sending trains around that they didn't even know where they came from. There were parts from 1974. How can you transport gas on top of that? That train was a piece of junk.
Ma si può mandarci sopra il gas? Ma si può, era un ferro vecchio quel treno.
Lì c'è stato un momento, no, in cui a un certo punto...
There was a moment where at a certain point you let yourself go or you decide to live. Despite the fact that I was immobile in a bed, and I did not even know if I was going to survive. They didn't know if I'd survive. In my mind, I started modeling a thought, which was a choice to live, consciously knowing that although my loved ones didn't make it, to live also for them, as best I could.
Ce l'avevano fatta, di vivere anche per loro al meglio.
The investigation and trials that followed the Viareggio disaster raised serious questions about the lack of regulation of these travelling bombs. and about the shoddy oversight of rail safety and maintenance throughout Europe.
I would like you to try, just for one day, to feel what we feel. Just for one day, just faking it, to feel what we feel with your positions of authority, what we feel in our heart, just for a day, and then no more. Then I hope you can live with your conscience.
It is a catastrophe that killed 32 people, yet could have been prevented. And it is a disaster that could happen again in any other town with a rail line, if Europe doesn't learn Viareggio's tragic lesson.
The Viareggio derailment exposed cracks that ran far deeper than the railway tracks themselves. Investigations revealed a web of responsibility, from equipment failures to maintenance decisions, to oversight that should have prevented it all. It led to years of legal battles, accountability questions, and a community demanding answers. But for those who lived through that night, no investigation could undo what was lost. Homes were gone, families shattered, lives changed forever in seconds. What went wrong in Viareggio wasn't just an accident. It was a system that failed at every level, and like so many disasters, the warning signs were there. They just weren't acted on. Join us next time for more episodes of What Went Wrong, where we continue to explore the moments everything fell apart. Like and subscribe to stay with us.